Early on the morning of January 10th, 2021, officers arrived at apartment number 48 on Gogol Street, nestled in a quiet neighborhood of Novgorod. For over a week, neighbors had reported an unusual and unpleasant odor coming from behind that door. Inside lived Louisa, 34, the wife of Daniel, a local engineer. Residents were used to Louisa being reclusive. She hadn't been seen in recent months. When no one responded to their persistent knocking, the officers made the decision to enter by force. The lock was opened swiftly. As soon as the door swung open, the strong odour confirmed that something was deeply wrong. Officers paused for a moment before entering, eventually proceeding with protective gear. In the bedroom, in extremely poor living conditions, they found Louisa. It was instantly clear that medical help was no longer an option. The apartment felt abandoned, disconnected from the surrounding residential atmosphere. The floor was cluttered with old newspapers, empty bottles and food containers, long past their shelf life. In the bathroom, the medicine cabinet was bare. No basic supplies, not even standard over-the-counter items. In the kitchen, the cupboards held almost nothing. The refrigerator contained only a dried-out loaf of bread and half a bottle of water. Among the clutter on the table lay a stack of unopened mail, electricity bills, bank notices, and other overdue correspondence. Dust and cobwebs coated the hallway walls, suggesting that no one had cleaned or even touched the surfaces in quite some time. While these details initially seemed like signs of neglect, they would later serve as significant clues. While investigators surveyed the apartment, they discovered Daniel, Louisa's husband, in the adjoining room. At 39 years old, he worked as an engineer at a nearby factory. His demeanour was troubling. His eyes were vacant, and his hands trembled slightly. When questioned about why he hadn't alerted anyone sooner, Daniel stated he had only found Louisa the previous morning. He said he had returned from work, noticed she wasn't well, and when she didn't respond, he became overwhelmed and couldn't focus enough to call for help. At first, his explanation appeared plausible, but inconsistencies quickly surfaced. Given the strong odour and the overall state of the apartment, it was hard to believe this situation had developed in just one day. As officers spoke with Daniel, neighbours came forward with another key piece of information. They mentioned a visitor who came to see Louisa once a month, someone they believed was a healthcare worker. He never stayed long, usually just 30 minutes, and then left promptly. No one knew his name or could describe him beyond noting that he wore what looked like medical attire. Strangely, no one in the building had ever interacted with him directly. This added a layer of mystery. Who was this individual, and what was his purpose in visiting Louisa so infrequently? At first glance, the situation seemed like one authorities had seen before, a sudden medical crisis in the context of isolation and untreated health conditions. Under such circumstances, a tragic health outcome was not out of the question. Initial documentation suggested that this may have been an unfortunate but natural occurrence. This interpretation allowed for a straightforward conclusion without inviting too much scrutiny. But seasoned investigators weren't convinced. Certain details stood out: the total absence of medication, the neglected state of the home, and most notably, Daniel's detached reaction. Although alert and responsive, he showed no clear understanding of what had occurred around him for weeks. Later that night, the coroner's preliminary report arrived at the police station. It included a detail that altered the entire trajectory of the investigation. According to initial findings, Louisa had been in her condition for approximately 3 weeks, far longer than the one day Daniel claimed. This suggested that he either knowingly misled authorities or was entirely unaware of what had been happening around him. Both possibilities raised serious concerns and required a more thorough investigation. At this point, the cause of Louisa's condition was not disclosed, as the expert chose to withhold specific conclusions for the time being. However, the single revelation about the timeline shifted the focus entirely. Daniel was now at the centre of attention. Investigators knew what needed to happen next. Every word and action would be re-examined to determine whether Daniel had truly been in shock, or whether he was concealing something far more significant. Why had Daniel not sought medical care for Louisa over the previous 6 months? Investigators believed the answer to this question might uncover deeper insights into what had taken place inside the neglected apartment. It quickly became clear that this was not merely a case of forgetfulness, but a deliberate choice, one that possibly concealed a more troubling explanation. Their first move was to examine the couple's financial activity. What they uncovered raised immediate concern. Over the past 6 months, monthly social support payments had been consistently deposited into Louisa's account. Though modest, about 15,000 rubles each month, the regularity of these deposits and their subsequent withdrawals drew attention. The most recent transaction occurred just days before authorities entered the residence. All of the withdrawals took place at a single ATM just a few minutes from the apartment. Surveillance footage showed Daniel using the machine late at night once a month. No one else was seen accompanying him. These funds were not used for paying household bills or purchasing medical supplies. Utility payments were overdue, there was no medication in the home, and food was practically non-existent. This left one question looming: where had all the money gone? When questioned again and shown the financial records, Daniel stayed composed but failed to convince investigators with his responses. He explained that the funds had been used to pay a caregiver whom he had personally hired to look after Louisa. While this might have sounded plausible, he was unable to provide any documentation. No signed agreement, no payment receipts, not even the caregiver's contact information. He stated that payments were made in cash and that they had chosen not to formalize the arrangement in order to save time and expenses. Investigators included his statement in the report, but under the circumstances it seemed questionable. The case grew more complex when neighbours confirmed that they had never seen any woman entering the apartment regularly, except the same mysterious man in medical attire who had made brief and infrequent visits. Based on earlier witness accounts, his visits lasted no longer than half an hour and occurred only once a month. Investigators began to suspect a financial motive. Daniel's consistent withdrawals of Louisa's support payments without any visible effort to ensure her care suggested a pattern that could align with financial misconduct. With no official oversight or regular welfare checks, the system allowed those payments to continue unimpeded. One working theory was that Daniel had intentionally kept Louisa's worsening condition hidden in order to continue receiving the funds. However, while this explanation seemed straightforward, it still left gaps. Investigators weren't fully convinced that financial fraud alone accounted for everything. Just as this version of events was becoming the primary focus, a neighbour arrived at the police station with a new piece of evidence: a photograph. The image showed Louisa standing next to another woman, who might have been the caregiver Daniel mentioned. The date on the photograph was from March 2020, about 9 months prior to the discovery in the apartment. What stood out was Louisa's appearance. She looked healthy, walking unaided and holding the hand of the unknown woman. The background was recognizable as the apartment building's courtyard, with nearby trees and fences in view. The neighbour who brought the photo said he had seen the two women together several times that spring. He had assumed the other woman was Louisa's aide, but beyond his recollection, no other resident could confirm seeing the same individual. After that point, the woman never reappeared. With this new lead, investigators now faced a different challenge: identifying the woman in the photo and learning why she stopped visiting, if she had truly been a caregiver at all. Until that could be confirmed, the image added more uncertainty than clarity. This discovery forced authorities to re-examine every detail of the case, especially Daniel's statements. The narrative was no longer confined to a possible financial violation. It hinted at something more hidden, possibly involving decisions or actions with greater implications than initially assumed. The situation became increasingly complex, and the more investigators tried to piece it together, the more tangled it seemed. They began to question whether this was ever about simple neglect or deception. Beneath the surface, there could be something far more elusive. And while the investigation continued, one critical piece remained unclear. Why had Louisa ended up alone in such distress, with no apparent help from anyone who claimed to care for her? At the time, Louisa and Daniel had been married for several years. Those who knew them described the couple as quiet and reserved, rarely drawing attention to themselves. This made it all the more unusual when Louisa was found alone behind the wheel in the middle of the night, under circumstances that raised more questions than answers. There was no clear reason for her being out at that hour, and Daniel later claimed he had no idea she had even left the apartment. According to the official traffic report, the accident occurred near the exit road from Novgorod toward the surrounding countryside. It was approximately 1:45 a.m. on February 10th, 2020, when Louisa's car, a silver Ford Focus, veered off the road and collided with a roadside utility pole. The impact was severe, and emergency services rushed Louisa to the hospital, where she was admitted in critical condition. She would later live with long-term physical challenges as a result. Toxicology results indicated that Louisa had no alcohol in her system. Blood alcohol content registered at 0.000. This confirmed that she was fully sober at the time of the incident, a point that aligned with her general lifestyle and behavior. However, one detail in the records drew immediate attention from investigators. Just 5 minutes before the crash, Louisa's phone had received a call from an unidentified number. It was the only call logged that night, and it went unanswered. The identity of the caller and the reason for the call remained unknown. At the time, this detail wasn't explored in depth. The phone log was simply added to the case file as routine documentation. Yet, in hindsight, that single call could have had far greater significance than anyone realized. It may have been a missed chance to uncover something deeper. When Louisa's parents were first interviewed, they stated that their daughter had gone out to buy groceries. But this explanation raised doubts from the beginning. Investigators quickly checked nearby businesses, and it became evident that all the local stores had closed well before 11 p.m., hours before Louisa left home. Moreover, security camera footage confirmed that she had passed by several of these locations without stopping or even slowing down. This contradicted the claim that she had gone out for shopping. Daniel, for his part, said he had been home that night, asleep and unaware of his wife's departure. Neighbours supported this claim, stating that the apartment was quiet and no disturbances had been heard. It appeared that Daniel only became aware of what had happened when he received the call from the hospital. The unanswered call just before the crash became the centre of the inquiry. It was theorised that Louisa may have been rushing to meet someone or possibly distancing herself from someone she was afraid of. The phone number belonged to a prepaid SIM card, purchased anonymously with no registration information attached. This made it nearly impossible to trace. What stood out was that the number didn't appear in Louisa's contact list. When investigators interviewed her family and friends, no one recognised it. It had never come up in any conversations, text messages, or earlier call records. This led to a new line of inquiry. Was this caller someone from her past, someone she was in contact with privately, or someone she had kept hidden from those around her? Theories emerged. Perhaps a person who was monitoring her or pressuring her. None of this could be confirmed yet, but the lack of answers was deeply concerning. Then, several days after the crash, investigators noticed something that had initially been overlooked. Louisa's mobile phone was missing. It wasn't found inside the vehicle, nor was it located at the crash site. When police later searched the couple's home for additional information, it wasn't there either. Daniel said he hadn't seen it since the night of the accident and believed it had been with her at the time. Medical staff who responded to the scene couldn't recall seeing a phone among her belongings. This absence raised even more questions. The phone could have held vital information about Louisa's movements, her communication that night, or even clues to her state of mind. Its disappearance suggested that someone may have deliberately removed or hidden it, perhaps even after emergency services had arrived. With no digital footprint to follow, investigators were left to piece together events from indirect clues. The missing phone made it significantly harder to determine whether Louisa had left home voluntarily or had been pressured in some way. It also made the unknown caller's role even more significant. As new evidence continued to emerge, the earlier assumption that the crash had been a tragic but isolated event became harder to support. There were too many unanswered questions, too many oddities. Who had called Louisa that night? Why had she left home without informing anyone? And what had happened to her phone? These questions marked a shift in the investigation, from a presumed accident to something potentially more deliberate. While nothing could yet be proven, the pattern of unusual details strongly suggested that this night was not as random as it once seemed, and whatever had taken place in those moments before the crash was likely to be a turning point in understanding what had led to the later unravelling of Louisa's life. The investigation was now moving into deeper and more complex territory. While many details remained unclear, one thing had become undeniable. The missing phone and the identity of the unknown caller held the key to understanding what had really taken place. For a while, progress was slow. But then an unexpected event shifted the entire course of the case. On the morning of January 15th, 2021, a crew from Novgorod's municipal services began maintenance work on the building's plumbing system. They had been assigned to inspect and repair sewer pipes located in the basement of the very building where Louisa and Daniel lived. During the process, one of the plumbers spotted something unusual lodged among the dirt and debris. It was a smartphone, an older model Samsung Galaxy A50 released in 2019. Though covered in grime, it appeared largely intact. The discovery prompted immediate interest from law enforcement. The phone was carefully retrieved and passed on to digital forensic experts. It didn't take long to confirm that the device had belonged to Louisa. The SIM card inside matched her number, and the memory still contained fragments of data, despite the device's condition. What they found changed the scope of the investigation entirely. Most notably, the call log revealed that on the night of August 15th, 2020, Louisa had made 5 back-to-back attempts to reach Daniel. Each call lasted only a few seconds and went unanswered. From that date onward, records showed a drastic shift. Louisa no longer communicated with anyone and had effectively stopped leaving the apartment. This timeline raised a new set of questions for Daniel, who had never mentioned anything about that night. He was summoned for questioning once more. Investigators presented the phone to him and explained where it had been located. They also detailed the call records and asked for his response. Daniel's reaction was unexpected. He showed no surprise, no confusion. Just a calm, measured acknowledgement. He simply said he hadn't known the phone had been found. Beyond that, he added nothing, and didn't ask a single question about how or why the device had ended up beneath his apartment. The investigating officers found this lack of curiosity deeply unusual. His composed demeanour was noted in the report as particularly troubling. From their perspective, it almost seemed as if Daniel had anticipated the discovery. Theories began forming quickly. One possibility was that someone, perhaps even Daniel, had intentionally disposed of the phone by dropping it into the plumbing system, hoping it would never be recovered. It would have been a calculated move to erase traces of digital evidence. The exact path the phone took to end up near the sewer pipe remained unclear, but the proximity to the couple's unit strongly suggested it had originated from their apartment. Investigators didn't dismiss the idea that another individual could have played a role. The possibility of a third party attempting to remove incriminating material to either shield Daniel or direct suspicion toward him was now being considered. But no theory could be confirmed yet. Then, only one day after the phone's discovery, the forensic team finished extracting additional content. What they found was even more significant than the call records. Among the most recent files were several photographs, timestamped December 10th, 2020. The images were taken hurriedly and under poor lighting. They showed crumpled sheets, and on them were visible marks that looked consistent with dried blood. In the corners of the photos, parts of someone's hands were partially captured, though not clearly enough to identify the individual. What stood out was the environment depicted in the pictures. It was recognizable as Louisa and Daniel's bedroom. From the angle and focus, experts concluded the images had likely been taken by someone in a state of urgency or emotional distress. There was no evidence of staging. Instead, the photographs seemed like spontaneous attempts to document something alarming. The implications were serious. Until now, no one had suspected that Louisa had felt compelled to record such a moment. The presence of those images suggested that something deeply concerning had occurred in that room. An incident she had chosen to document, possibly fearing no one would believe her otherwise. And then, not long after capturing the images, the phone had been removed from the apartment and discarded. This sequence strongly implied that someone had taken steps to destroy potential evidence. This discovery forced investigators to re-evaluate the entire case. Up to this point, theories had revolved around neglect, financial misconduct, or emotional breakdown. Now, the possibility that Louisa had attempted to alert someone through photos and calls shifted the investigation into a far more urgent direction. The focus now turned to two crucial questions. Whose hands were visible in the photographs, and under what circumstances had those images been taken? For the investigators, the presence of those pictures was a breakthrough. It meant that someone had tried to conceal important details, but now the truth was closer to being uncovered. The final months of Louisa's life were no longer seen through a lens of isolation alone. Something had happened in that apartment, and for the first time, the team had concrete leads that might help them understand exactly what it was. The investigation was entering a critical phase, even though the full picture remained elusive. On January 18th, 2021, investigators uncovered a significant detail from Daniel's personal history. It was revealed that he had voluntarily resigned from his job exactly 1 week before Louisa's passing. For over 8 years, Daniel had worked as an engineer at a local firm. His departure surprised colleagues and supervisors alike. The timing now raised new concerns. Was there a link between Daniel's resignation and what had unfolded in the apartment days later? Investigators turned to his former workplace to understand the context of his decision. During interviews with company employees, it emerged that Daniel had been struggling with financial pressure in recent months. He often described his situation as a financial pit, confiding in co-workers about increasing debts, which reportedly surpassed 700,000 rubles, approximately 8,000 euros. A record in the company's HR department included an interview where Daniel openly stated that his financial obligations had become overwhelming. Former colleagues noted that in the months leading up to his resignation, he appeared withdrawn and avoided most social interaction. Despite this, few anticipated that he would leave so abruptly. Many believed the weight of his debts had finally prompted the decision, though it remained puzzling to give up a consistent salary during such a difficult time. When Daniel was called back in for questioning, investigators asked him directly why he had left his position. His answer was brief and unelaborated. "I got tired." He did not expand on the reasoning, leaving officials with little insight. To further understand his actions following his resignation, the investigative team reviewed his internet activity through his service provider. The data confirmed that Daniel had spent most of his time at home in the weeks preceding the discovery. Records showed he was frequently online, spending long hours each day engaged in an online multiplayer game. His IP address and session logs confirmed his physical presence in the apartment during this entire period. While the data confirmed his location, it did not absolve him. In fact, the information raised even more questions. If Daniel had indeed been home, it was nearly impossible for him not to have noticed Louisa's condition. His continued gaming habits suggested a deliberate choice to ignore what was happening just a room away. Whether from denial, emotional withdrawal, or something more complex, the behavior appeared disturbingly indifferent. Meanwhile, another early theory was being reassessed. Financial experts concluded their analysis of Louisa's social assistance payments. It had been assumed that Daniel had continued withdrawing her benefits with the intention of using them for his own financial issues. However, the findings told a different story. The funds had remained almost untouched. There were no signs that the money had been spent on clearing debts, purchasing food, or acquiring medical supplies. With no trace of the funds being used, the assumption of a financial scheme was officially dismissed. Daniel had indeed accumulated significant personal debt, but he had made no effort to settle any of it using Louisa's benefits. Instead, the money remained idle, raising even more questions. Why continue withdrawing funds that were never used? Amid these confusing findings, forensic teams intensified their examination of the apartment. Particular focus was given to the bedroom. Experts studied the accumulation of dust and organic particles to estimate how long it had been since the linens were last changed. The result shocked even seasoned professionals. The evidence indicated that Louisa's bedding had not been changed for at least 4 months, dating back to mid-September 2020. This information suggested that regular care and hygiene had ended long before Louisa's condition had become critical. From that time onward, no one had cleaned the space or made any visible effort to maintain it. Investigators found this inaction increasingly difficult to understand. Why had Daniel not called for help? Why had he not reached out to anyone, especially considering he was physically present and apparently aware? Still, officials avoided making early judgments. They carefully documented each finding, noting only what could be confirmed. What was now clear was that the case was more intricate than originally assumed. As the investigation moved forward, the trail offered more questions than answers. Yet the team pressed on. What remained certain was this: something deeply troubling had unfolded in that apartment, and the truth was still waiting to be uncovered. They still didn't fully grasp what kind of individual they were dealing with, or what exactly he might have been concealing, especially considering he continued playing online games while his wife, Louisa, reportedly lost the ability to move and seek assistance. The investigation appeared to be slowly hitting a standstill until a new voice entered the scene. Carmen, the couple's neighbour who had previously avoided speaking to authorities, suddenly stepped forward. To corroborate her memory, investigators examined her WhatsApp messages. Indeed, on August 1st, 2020, Carmen had messaged a friend saying, "They're fighting again." When asked who she meant, she replied, "The neighbours." Carmen added that the woman next door had been yelling for a second consecutive night. These messages were sent around 11:15 p.m. When asked why she hadn't come forward earlier, Carmen said she didn't want to intrude on what she assumed were private matters. Daniel, when questioned again about this specific period, remained composed. He confirmed that he was indeed spending extended hours on his computer at the time, playing online games. But Carmen was clear and unwavering. The voice she heard, she insisted, belonged to Louisa, and the tone wasn't playful or game-related. Thanks to Carmen's statements and the digital timestamps on her messages, investigators now considered it possible that a serious altercation might have occurred in the couple's apartment that summer. While there was no clinical proof to support this yet, the suggestion itself was compelling enough to warrant deeper review. Authorities decided to obtain Louisa's medical records from August and September 2020 to check if she had sought help, or if she might have been silently enduring a troubling situation. 2 days after Carmen gave her statement, law enforcement also requested documentation from the building's management office. What they found added yet another curious detail. On August 3rd, 2020, a resident living below Louisa and Daniel had submitted a complaint, reporting water dripping from the couple's balcony for several hours. The maintenance team investigated and confirmed the outer wall had been damp, but no source of the issue was discovered. When they tried to reach someone at the apartment, no one answered. The situation was ultimately chalked up to a possible oversight by the residents, but in light of everything else, that incident now seemed far less random. Authorities began to consider whether the water leak might have been deliberate, possibly intended to mask sound or activity within the apartment during a critical moment. The timeline also aligned closely with the dates Carmen had mentioned in her messages. These overlapping pieces of information heightened concerns. It became clear that whatever happened in August 2020 could be central to understanding everything that followed. Investigators began drafting formal requests to hospitals and clinics, hoping to access Louisa's health records for that time frame. They needed to determine whether any medical visits or entries might point to distress or injury that had gone previously unnoticed or unreported. Clarifying what transpired in that crucial month was now viewed as essential to understanding the complex circumstances surrounding Louisa's final months. Only by untangling the timeline could investigators hope to reach the truth. On February 1st, 2021, investigators received information that cast new doubt on the previously assumed timeline of events leading up to Louisa's passing. Representatives from a medical supplies delivery service came forward with records of orders paid for using Daniel's bank card. These orders included personal care materials typically intended for individuals with limited mobility, such as disposable sheets, hygiene items, and gloves. What immediately caught attention was that none of these orders were delivered to Daniel and Louisa's home. Instead, all packages had been sent to a different address several kilometers away. This raised immediate concerns for the investigators, prompting them to contact the courier who regularly made these deliveries. The courier, a young man, clearly recalled the deliveries. He described the recipient as an older woman who never spoke much, never asked questions, and always received the packages herself. She never mentioned Daniel or Louisa, nor did she hand the packages to anyone else. According to the courier, Daniel was never present, nor had he ever interacted with him in any way. The woman was not listed as a resident at that address, and neighbours claimed they didn't know her. Her identity remained unclear, and investigators treated this as a high-priority lead. Daniel was again called in for questioning. When presented with the delivery records, he responded briefly, "I gave the wrong address." Investigators noted that the number of deliveries totaled 7, each arriving weekly and containing similar contents. The idea that Daniel had made the same mistake 7 times in a row was difficult to believe. Moreover, Daniel had made no attempt to correct the delivery address with the service provider or alert anyone about the error. He also never visited the alternative address to collect the packages. These decisions, or lack thereof, suggested that the so-called error may have been intentional. Investigators began to suspect that this pattern pointed to a deliberate choice rather than simple carelessness. In parallel, authorities had completed verification of a phone number associated with a key moment in Louisa's past. It belonged to the individual who had contacted her shortly before her traffic accident in February 2020. The number traced back to the same older woman who had received the medical deliveries. As it turned out, she was a retired nurse and an old acquaintance of Louisa's family. When questioned, the woman calmly acknowledged the call. She explained that she had reached out simply to ask how Louisa was doing. Her explanation aligned with the call's timing and tone, and authorities closed the case concerning any possible harassment or mysterious caller. The idea that Louisa had been pursued or stalked before the accident was now officially ruled out. However, the interview did not end there. The woman shared an important new detail. In August 2020, by which time Louisa had already become reclusive, she had contacted Daniel personally. As a former healthcare professional, she had observed worrying signs in Louisa's condition and urged Daniel to seek professional medical help. She even suggested hospitalization and emphasized the need for urgent care. According to her, Daniel's response was unexpectedly firm. He refused the recommendation, assuring her that he had everything under control and that no help was needed. This refusal, now seen in light of other evidence, seemed more than just misplaced confidence. Daniel had turned down offers of help not only from professionals but from people who genuinely cared about Louisa. Combined with the delivery orders that never arrived at the couple's actual residence, his behavior seemed increasingly difficult to explain. Why request supplies for a person needing care only to have them delivered somewhere else and never used? Why actively decline medical help when it was offered? Investigators found these choices highly unusual and possibly intentional. As the investigation continued, Daniel's behavior no longer fit within the boundaries of simple neglect. It appeared more deliberate, carefully managed in a way that limited outside intervention. He remained inside the home during crucial months, yet appeared to isolate both himself and Louisa from the outside world. Investigators noted this as a key factor in the case and made the decision to explore it further in upcoming stages. By mid-February, one conclusion became increasingly clear. Understanding Daniel's behavior meant more than reviewing documents or timelines. The heart of the mystery might lie in his psychological profile. What could cause a person, outwardly calm and previously seen as responsible, to take such a passive approach to a worsening situation involving his own spouse? On the morning of February 10th, 2021, psychologists presented their formal evaluation of Daniel to the police. That report, they hoped, would shed light on the internal world of the man at the center of this growing investigation. The conclusion pointed to clear signs of emotional burnout and a deeply troubling psychological state. But could this fully explain what had unfolded? To get closer to understanding Daniel's mindset, investigators examined his online gaming chat history, where he had spent most of his time since the latter half of 2020. Disturbing messages from December of that year began to paint a clearer picture. In several conversations with other players, Daniel had typed phrases like, "I want to disappear. There's no point anymore." Other messages conveyed a sense of helplessness and isolation. These statements weren't rare, they appeared frequently, sometimes multiple times a day. Although the investigation reports were written in a matter-of-fact tone, they outlined unmistakable indicators of Daniel's declining mental health. A psychological assessment conducted independently confirmed signs of emotional distress. Still, that alone couldn't fully answer the more difficult questions about his actions or the lack thereof. Then came a new piece of information uncovered during a standard review of property records. Official documents showed that exactly 1 month prior to the incident, Daniel had transferred ownership of an apartment to his father. When investigators questioned him about the decision, Daniel simply responded, "It was necessary." He offered no further clarification, asked no questions in return, and remained detached throughout. Legally, the transfer was in order, but the timing raised serious concerns. This prompted investigators to consider a new theory. Could Daniel have been preparing for something irreversible? The property transfer, the withdrawn behavior, and the increasingly despairing messages all suggested a potential plan involving withdrawal from life entirely. It was one possibility, but far from a confirmed truth. For now, it remained a working hypothesis. Investigators knew that this theory might simply be a distraction, potentially created by Daniel himself, to shift attention away from deeper truths. That same day, a forensic specialist submitted a preliminary medical report. The findings once again redirected the investigation to its central focus. The medical report concluded that Louisa's condition was completely manageable, had appropriate care been given in time. The expert made it clear no specialized medical training was needed to recognize the seriousness of her state. A simple call for professional help could have changed everything. These findings suggested a direct link between the absence of action and the resulting outcome. Now, the key question remained, were Daniel's choices driven purely by mental health struggles, or was there a more calculated element to them? His emotional detachment explained part of the picture, but it didn't excuse the outcome. For the investigators, the priority became establishing clear intent. Compassion could not interfere with their judgment. Daniel, from their perspective, had shown a pattern of detachment that left little room for empathy. The language of the expert evaluations portrayed him as someone inwardly focused, disengaged from his environment, and emotionally numb. Understanding how he allowed the situation to unfold became critical. This understanding would either support the theory of negligence caused by emotional collapse or point to something far more deliberate. The case was nearing a decisive turn. While Daniel's psychological condition complicated matters, it could not erase accountability. The evidence collected so far had built a strong foundation. Investigators believed they were close to the full truth. By mid-September 2020, Louisa had been receiving consistent in-home medical support following a previous health incident. According to official logs, she was scheduled to receive visits from a nurse 3 times a week to help stabilize her condition. But beginning September 15th, all of these visits stopped abruptly and without any documented explanation. This abrupt interruption raised another critical question. Why did the support end so suddenly, and who was responsible for halting it? Investigators turned their attention to the insurance provider responsible for covering Louisa's home healthcare services, hoping that the records would reveal what had gone wrong and who had made that crucial decision. In response to the inquiry, a formal document was submitted, dated September 15, 2020, containing a signed waiver for continued medical services. The document bore Louisa's name and signature. The insurance company confirmed they had received the original via mail and, based on a preliminary comparison, did not find anything suspicious. The signature closely resembled others previously filed under her name. On the surface, everything appeared legitimate. Still, investigators withheld final judgment until they received the handwriting expert's conclusion. Meanwhile, Carmen, a neighbour who had earlier mentioned hearing distressing noises from the couple's apartment, was brought in for a second round of questioning. This time, her account provided crucial additional context. Carmen stated that on the same night the medical waiver was dated, she noticed Daniel near the building's garbage bins. She observed him discarding several large black bags, which seemed to contain items like empty medical containers, disposable gloves, and bandages. At the time, she hadn't thought much of it and hadn't informed anyone, unaware that Louisa's medical support had been discontinued. But in hindsight, her recollection took on significant weight, suggesting a possible effort by Daniel to quietly dispose of medical materials. A few days later, the forensic handwriting expert delivered their analysis. The conclusion was definitive. Louisa's signature on the waiver had been falsified. Daniel had replicated her handwriting with such precision that it initially passed undetected by insurance staff. This single act shifted the entire course of the investigation. The possibility of a misunderstanding or external coercion was ruled out. Daniel's actions were now officially viewed as a deliberate withdrawal of essential medical care, placing his behaviour under legal scrutiny for willful neglect and purposeful intent. What might have once seemed like a tragic convergence of unrelated events had now clearly taken a more serious tone. And even then the developments were far from over. Investigators retrieved surveillance footage from a local supermarket where the couple routinely shopped. What they found raised grave concerns. Over the final month before Louisa's passing, Daniel was seen visiting the store weekly. But each time he purchased only a single small bottle of water, just 1.5 ounces. No other groceries or necessities were bought. The repeated pattern, captured clearly on video, indicated a disturbing level of disregard for basic needs. This behaviour aligned with an emerging theory that the lack of food and care in Louisa's final weeks wasn't due to chance or hardship, but reflected deliberate choices. While the investigation still had to determine the specific legal classification of Daniel's actions, the facts now strongly supported the theory of consistent and knowing decisions that negatively affected Louisa's health. Though investigators remained careful and professional in tone, the evidence was pointing in only one direction. They were looking at a case where someone had allegedly fostered an environment incompatible with normal life. The exact reasons behind these actions remained under study. But even before motives were fully examined, the core issue, neglect escalating toward conscious harm, was being documented in legal terms. Investigators continued to compile irrefutable proof, aiming to build a case that would stand firmly in court. Then, just as the case was nearing closure in mid-March, something unexpected occurred. A retired neighbour named Pablo, long dismissed as a background witness, showed up unannounced at the police station. Quietly, he placed an old USB flash drive on the investigator's desk. The contents, he said, came from a security camera mounted above the building's entrance. The recordings spanned from August 2020 to January 2021 and might hold the final decisive evidence. Over the next several days, the investigation team examined the footage closely. The camera, positioned discreetly above the entryway, had captured hours of material, routine but revealing. It recorded every entry and exit of the residence, including Daniel's movements, without interruption. What appeared at first to be mundane footage would soon take on a far deeper significance. According to the surveillance footage, the suspect was observed leaving the apartment no more than twice a week. Each time, his outings were brief. What stood out the most was that he never returned with shopping bags, supplies, or anything one would expect when caring for someone with limited mobility. Additionally, each of his departures was clearly logged by time and date, making it impossible for unrecorded deliveries or outside assistance to go unnoticed. During trial proceedings, Daniel's legal team attempted to challenge this footage, claiming that all essential goods and medications were delivered by courier services, explaining why he was never seen carrying supplies. However, investigators had already obtained records from all the major delivery services in the city earlier in the year. These records firmly contradicted the defence's position. Not a single order had been placed for Daniel and Louisa's residence between August 2020 and January 2021. Surveillance confirmed no delivery attempts at all. This left the defence in a difficult position, and their argument was dismissed by the court. At the same stage, the court received the report from the appointed forensic psychiatrist. The conclusion was clear. Daniel was found to be fully mentally competent and aware of his actions. There were no psychological conditions present that would diminish his responsibility in the matter. Furthermore, any suggestion that Daniel had expressed emotional instability or harmful intent toward himself was determined to be unfounded. That line of inquiry was officially closed, with investigators now concentrating solely on the deliberate neglect as the core issue of the case. Just when it seemed that the proceedings were nearing a firm conclusion, the defence introduced an unexpected and highly controversial claim. In court, Daniel's lawyer stated that Louisa had personally asked her husband not to prolong her struggle. No documents, audio or third-party confirmations were provided, only Daniel's own account. He asserted that this had been her final request. The courtroom fell silent. The emotional weight of such a claim was undeniable, and since it couldn't be easily disproven, it risked shifting public sentiment and raising difficult ethical questions. Investigators recognized the need to prepare a firm response. Without direct evidence to counter the claim, the prosecution focused on a body of indirect yet powerful evidence pointing to a consistent pattern of disregard over time. The case now moved into its most crucial stage. Each piece of testimony, each document, and each moment in court had the potential to shape the final outcome. The prosecution aimed to present a conclusive case that Daniel's actions were not shaped by compassion, but by deliberate decisions with serious consequences. On April 10, 2021, the final hearing took place in a quiet courtroom on Justice Street in Novgorod. It was standing room only. After years of uncertainty and mounting questions, the court delivered its decision. Daniel was found guilty of causing Louisa's death through intentional inaction. The court ruled that he had withdrawn her from medical care, falsified signatures on official forms, kept neighbours and social services in the dark, and created a misleading appearance of normalcy. According to Spanish law, his actions met the criteria for criminal responsibility under Article 138 of the Penal Code. The forensic team had ruled out natural causes. Their findings from January 2021 confirmed that Louisa's condition could have been managed with minimal assistance. Experts concluded that the outcome was preventable. A financial investigation also uncovered that Daniel had continued withdrawing government support funds intended for Louisa, but those funds were not used for her benefit. The court took this into account as further evidence of intent.